Did Russia just reveal evidence that Jesus was black? When you think of Jesus, what kind of picture do you paint in your head? Is it a white man, blonde hair, and blue eyes? Well, for me, Jesus is a black man, but now the truth is finally coming out. So Russia opened up its vaults and revealed pictures that have the whole world, or at least the Western world, talking. These pictures portray biblical figures that they always pictured as white people differently. That's right. According to these new pictures, a lot of biblical figures you've come to know over the years had dark skin, which means they were likely black people and not white. And no, this isn't just mere speculation. What Russia has revealed seems to be authentic pictures. However, this brings up so many questions. Did they just decide to ignore these facts when they started to create modern-day portraits of Jesus? Was this done on purpose, or was it simply overlooked? Jesus is one of the most well-known figures throughout the history of our world. He said he was born to a woman named Mary, the Son of God, who came to earth and began his own ministry by the age of 30. Throughout his years on this planet, Jesus performed miracles. When church leaders and other people in power started to feel threatened by what Jesus was capable of, they decided to crucify him. However, just 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. This is the story that has been told of Jesus Christ. However, when you take a look at the Western world, there's one very common similarity you'll see whenever someone tries to visualize Jesus. Even on official websites such as the Church of Jesus Christ, you'll see this biblical figure depicted as a white man in every single picture that represents him. This isn't the way that Jesus is depicted to everyone, and with Russia opening up its vaults to reveal pictures of dark-skinned biblical figures, it might be time to rethink how we picture what the Bible tells us. Just last year, Putin announced that a religious icon that was kept secure in a Russian museum will be moved to a church in Moscow. Even though it was said that the painting would remain the property of the state, Putin believed that believers would appreciate it more when seen in a church. Thus, the Russian Orthodox Church received the painting and became responsible for its restoration.
As the Ukraine-Russia war drags on, Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided to move one of Russia's holiest icons from a museum to a Moscow cathedral.
This painting was called the Trinity Icon. It featured drawings that represent the three angels said to have visited Abraham. However, that was just the first of many clues, or rather pieces of evidence, Russia made public to help spread awareness of what seems to be the truth behind famous biblical figures. Now, to thicken the plot, Russia decided to reveal it all. This time, Russia revealed an entire vault of pictures that they have been holding on to for years. One thing that we have to note is the fact that Jesus isn't portrayed the same way in every area of the world or culture.
And to Romans back then, the stories of Jesus healing people and raising people from the dead were understandably seen as being stories about magic.
However, in the Western world, he's become known as a European white man with long blonde hair and, of course, blue eyes. If you take a look at churches in countries that aren't really part of the Western world, well, then things are different. There are pictures of Jesus that portray him in different cultures, from Chinese to a man from the Middle East, and then, of course, there are churches that have portraits of a black Jesus. The new evidence from Russia further supports the fact that Jesus wasn't the man we've been told. He was likely not a European man with white skin, but rather a black man. Russia didn't just reveal Jesus was likely black, but also many other biblical figures that have been portrayed as white for centuries. The truth is that revealing all of these pictures has now sparked so many questions. These questions have been on our minds perhaps, but haven't been asked, and curiosity has been sparked. One of the biggest questions that comes to mind when we look at everything is why we've been told that Jesus was a white man. Many people think that they derive this conclusion from the Bible, but that's not true. To explain this, we'll have to take a look at the Bible. Specifically, you'll want to turn your attention to the first 4 books that come with the New Testament in the Bible. These are the main areas where you'll see mentions of Jesus and the work he did throughout his life. However, no matter how far you dig into these 4 books, you're not going to find many details about the appearance of Jesus. For many scholars, Revelation chapter 1, verses 14-15 offers a clue that Jesus' skin was a darker hue and that his hair was woolly in texture. The hair of his head, it says, were white as white wool, white as snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined as in a furnace. So what exactly does the Bible teach us about Jesus? Well, according to the Bible, Jesus was Jewish. He was born in Bethlehem and then raised in Nazareth. This area is situated in what we call Israel today. In Luke chapter 3, verse 23, we get some details about how old Jesus was when he started his ministry. The verse reads, "When he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli." However, you won't find anything related to what race or culture Jesus was, apart from the fact that he was born a Jewish man. Then, when soldiers were ordered to arrest Jesus before his crucifixion, the soldiers didn't know who Jesus was. Judah, who betrayed Jesus Christ, as the Bible tells us, had to point Jesus out in the crowd. This means Jesus looked very similar to others who lived in the same city. During the first century, there wasn't something like a camera that someone could use to take a picture of Jesus. That would have made this entire debate so much easier to solve. You'd be able to look at a photograph of Jesus and easily tell if he was black or white. However, we can turn to paintings that have been kept safe over the years to learn more about Jesus and other biblical figures that we read about in the Bible. We've talked about the Trinity painting, which showed 3 angels with dark skin. However, there are many others that have also now been shared. Many of these paintings show people who have been portrayed as white by Western cultures as figures with dark skin. At this point, there's something really important that I want to mention. These paintings have been preserved for many years. However, they were drawn at one point by people who portrayed Jesus and other biblical figures as being dark-skinned. This means at the time of painting, the artists were aware of the true origins of Jesus Christ. They portrayed biblical characters according to how things were in the world. However, over time, things have changed, and whites started to rule, which ultimately led to widespread racism across the world. Europeans had a big role to play in this entire process, which also explains a lot when we take a closer look at modern-day portraits of Mary, Jesus, Joseph, and even angels. The common thing we see is the fact that the portraits all portray these people as white. They look like the typical European.
We see that racial apartheid can be sustained using the white supremacist logic that flows from white Jesus.
Something that you shouldn't overlook here is the fact that Europeans started to colonize other countries. When they discovered black people in Africa, these Europeans viewed themselves as superior. They started to take these black people all over the world, enslaved. If the Europeans started an era where white people saw themselves as a superior race to blacks, then it explains a lot, actually. And when we look at things this way, it could mean that Europeans decided to rewrite history. They targeted religion and decided to wipe out what was known of these biblical figures, particularly when considering their appearance. Then Europeans started to create paintings that will become the modern Western culture portrayal of Jesus Christ. By spreading these new visions of biblical figures as white people, Europeans were able to continue their pursuit of portraying the whites as the superior race. This brings up another important point. We have to travel back in time for this one. Remember that Europeans only enter what we now know as the Age of Discovery in the 15th century. However, the story of Jesus starts in the 1st century. In a period of 14 centuries, a lot can change in the world. We need to go even further back to the 2nd millennium BC. According to the Old Testament, which is also known as the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrews originated in this time. Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham, the patriarchs of Israel, are said to have been the forefathers of what became the Hebrews. These people inhabited Canaan, but today we know this place as Palestine. The Bible tells us that Abraham, as instructed by God, headed to a new land. He was responsible for creating a new nation, and that nation is what we know as Israel today. Here's an interesting fact. The Hebrews later became the Jewish people. They were also called Israelites, particularly due to the area they inhabited during these times. Let's take a look at a phrase from the Bible. In Mishnah Nejaim 2:1, it reads, "The children of Israel are like boxwood, neither black nor white, but of an intermediate shade." This already gives us an idea that the Israelites from the time were definitely not white. Over the years, it also seems like races mixed. The thing that you have to remember at this point is the fact that Jesus was born in Israel. He was born to a Jewish woman, also from Israel. So, this phrase from the Hebrew Bible already gives us evidence that Jesus was in fact not white. It's not a conspiracy that we're talking about here. These words come from the Old Testament. However, this proves Jesus and Mary, along with many other biblical figures we've been introduced to as white, were not of this race. It does not prove that these people were black, but we're getting somewhere. Now let's turn our attention to a paper that was written by Rudolph Windsor and published in 1935. It is currently available in the Smithsonian libraries and focuses on the fact that the original Jews were likely black. According to Windsor, Abraham, also called Abram, in some scriptures was actually of black Shemite origin. He became known as the father of both Arab and the Hebrew Israelite nations at the time. The Bible can back us up on this. Remember where we talked about the fact that the Bible referred to some of these people as having boxwood color skin? Well, if you head over to Genesis chapter 42 verse 7, there's quite an interesting passage.
And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them, but made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, Whence come ye? And they said, From the land of Canaan, to buy food.
Of course, different versions of the Bible exist today, and the words aren't exactly the same in each. However, the meaning behind them and what they describe remains equal. Then, Genesis chapter 42 verse 8 reads,
And Joseph knew his brethren, but they knew not him.
This is where things get interesting. You see, Joseph was not originally from Egypt. Joseph's brothers placed him in a hole and then decided to sell him to the Midianites. He ended up in Egypt and climbed his way to the second in command under Egypt's Pharaoh. After all those years, he finally saw his brothers for the first time. He was able to recognize them, but they didn't know who he was. Now, for a moment, imagine if Joseph was light-skinned, or as the white Europeans have made us believe since the 15th century, he would have stood out. It's no secret that the people from ancient Egypt during the times when pharaohs ruled were dark-skinned. If you head over to a museum in Egypt, you'll quickly be able to recognize this fact. So for his brothers to not recognize him, it would mean that he must have blended in with the other Egyptians. And this brings us to the conclusion that Joseph was actually dark-skinned like those around him. There have been several cases where people, including TV shows, have explored the possibility that Joseph was in fact a black man. Of course, Joseph wasn't Jesus, but he still played an important role in the Bible. And if you look at the art from modern times that paint a picture of Joseph, he's portrayed as a white man. Yet when you dig deeper into what the Bible says and consider historical facts as well, then it becomes easier to see the truth. Jesus came years after Joseph, so it's possible that races mixed in the Israel area between these years. However, once again, these are only a few passages of the Bible that reveal things that we can link to each other. So while the Bible doesn't actually say anything about the true identity of Jesus in terms of appearance, what we do know is that his ancestors were Jewish, previously known as Hebrews. We also know from looking at passages from the Bible itself that these people were definitely not white. We've been brainwashed since birth, but it's time for us to take our power back and realize who we truly are. If you're ready to educate yourself and learn the information they never taught you in school, click the link in our bio to grab our new bundle called Unlock Minds. It includes multiple ebooks breaking down our real history, opens your mind to your true potential, and gives you the blueprint to black power and wealth. Click the link in the description to grab yours now for 80% off before it's too late. Thank you for the support. With the evidence we have in our hands, it's become easier to draw conclusions. And if we put everything together, then it's true. There's a big chance that the biblical figures that the Europeans have been describing as white were actually black people in reality. This brings up another important question. Where did the idea of a white Jesus come from? Sure, we can say that the Europeans spread paintings and other works that portrayed these biblical figures as white people in Europe, but what about the rest of the world? Before we dig into that, we have to look at Christianity in the early ages. What many people think is that the Europeans brought Christianity to Africa. However, this is actually not true. It's rather that these Europeans brought their views of Christianity, portrayed by their own cultures, into Africa. According to Andrew Butterworth, a leader at the God First Church East Rand in South Africa, Christianity existed in Africa long before the Europeans came to this area. He explains that the Europeans did not bring Christianity to Africa. When the Europeans arrived in Africa, there were already churches and church fathers. Since Northern Africa formed part of the Roman Empire at the time, many people in the modern day think that these church fathers were white. However, that's also not true, as they were actually from various native cultures and races that were present in Africa long before. During these early times, there was one man who really stood out, known as Augustine of Hippo. Yet once again, if we take a closer look at art that portrays him, you guessed it, they're all of a white man. Augustine was responsible for creating more than 500 sermons. He wrote 113 books in his time, and a total of 218 letters were also linked to this man. There are two specific books that Augustine wrote that had a big role to play in shaping the way of theological thinking. There is controversy surrounding Augustine, especially when it comes to his origins. Many believe that this man was born to a Christian woman and a pagan man. It is also thought that Augustine was born into an upper-class family in North Africa during the Roman Empire. These beliefs have created what many people think is a white man who laid the foundations for early Christianity and theological thinking. However, once again, this is likely an image that was later painted by Europeans once they started to colonize the African country. The truth is, Augustine was actually from the Berbers people. This was a native, or as some call it, an indigenous group in Africa. That means that Augustine was not a white man, but was black instead. According to experts, Christianity actually came from areas like Israel and then spread down south toward Africa. So now we know that, once again, indigenous people who became well known in the Christian community throughout Africa were later on portrayed as white people by the Europeans. We can now also dig deeper into the question we asked earlier: how the widespread portrayal of a white Jesus became so common in Western cultures. For this, we have to go back to AD 1350. From this time up until AD 1600, a lot of changes happened to the portrayal of Jesus. Now, something to keep in mind here is the fact that by portraying Jesus in a specific way, it would also portray other biblical figures from the time, such as Jesus' mother, Mary. As Christianity and the word of Jesus Christ spread throughout the world, cultures adopted it in their own ways. This also meant that many cultures portrayed Jesus as one of their own in early artwork. This is actually something that you'll see in many cultures today. However, being part of a Western culture, or the Western world as many call it, you won't really see this in the United States or even on the African continent. Now, let's take a journey through these times. And this starts with Leonardo da Vinci, who lived between 1452 and 1519. Leonardo became a very popular artist, and even today, many people continue to try to recreate some of his work. Leonardo became an inspiration for artists. He was the artist behind The Last Supper, a portrait that portrayed the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples before he was betrayed by one of his own. It took Leonardo 3 years to complete the painting, from 1495 up until 1498. The original painting still exists today and is preserved in the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie, Milano. Even today, Europeans and white people are finding ways to monetize these works of art, never questioning how some of these biblical characters were portrayed. Leonardo was an Italian from Europe, and as you might have guessed already, Jesus and the disciples who had this Last Supper with him were all portrayed as white people in Leonardo's painting. Here are more examples that we can look at. For example, in the Sistine Chapel, you can observe Michelangelo's The Last Judgment work of art. He was similar to Leonardo da Vinci, an Italian. Michelangelo was both a painter and a sculptor, and as we've learned when looking at Europeans, he portrayed Jesus and other biblical figures in his art as white people. As you can see, every single person portrayed in The Last Judgment has white skin. There are no blacks or dark-skinned people. And one thing to understand is that it shows a picture of the end times, the time when, according to the Bible, Jesus will return to earth and judge both those alive and those who have passed away. We can look at this as evidence of how the Europeans lived and what they believed during those times. If you take a closer look at this very specific image, you can clearly see that they believe only whites would be judged the day when Jesus came back to earth. Even though there are a couple of figures that seem to be painted a bit darker than the rest, these are hidden away really well, and none of them have any significance to play in the bigger picture. It's also where white supremacy comes into the picture. Christianity has spread to all corners of the world at that time, and by showing Western cultures that Jesus was white, they were able to use this fact to their advantage. Europeans began to colonize other parts of the world, and by bringing these images to Africa, they convinced the indigenous people that the Jesus and God that they had been worshiping were in fact white. Things are starting to turn around though. We're living in a world where racism might still be an issue, following the white supremacy issue that Europeans created when they decided to enslave black people. However, it is starting to fade, and people are beginning to wake up. With black people retaking their power and establishing themselves as a part of society, the truth can finally surface. And with what we already have, we don't really need to go digging for evidence anymore. There was clearly deception behind how Europeans portrayed biblical characters. And if we go look back throughout history, it's not easy to connect the dots. And this all shows that these biblical characters were definitely not white people. Of course, this isn't new for a lot of us, but for some brainwashed by the system, it may be. Do you think Jesus and so many of the other biblical figures were black? What do you think about this vault of evidence that Russia just opened up? Let me know in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe to get notified when I post new documentaries. See you next time, family.